Inkosi sekelele Afrika malopakaniso bandoayo izwa mitando zoye tu inkosi sekelele. Welcome to It Is Our Duty. We are here for another episode. I'm grateful to share with you the latest in the Black radical tradition, political education steered through the intentional community cooperative peer both the sower. Hope everyone is doing well. We're grateful to be here again for another week. And having steering the show that we have today, you're going to be able to get some information from something called the International Tribunal. And this International Tribunal comes about for this time period where something was centered specifically to show a different way of how things can be connected. So I'm very grateful. And what I've learned, it was a lot. Since Friday, it started. The opening was action-packed, and hopefully you all can see the rest of that. I'm going to show today's International Tribunal on the U.S. human rights abuses against Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. And this was on every day since Friday, and showing this particular day, which is all day Sunday. It was live streamed. It will come in a place to give you just an idea of what has happened for this weekend. And hopefully you will be able to watch if you go to their website or even the Facebook page. The Spirit of Mandela, you will see the rest of this weekend, meaning the trial that we have put together, the courts, the human rights lawyers that are involved. It's very powerful. So please stay tuned. We're going to start this for today. Again, it was since Friday, and I'm very excited to be a part of watching and observing all weekend. I mean, action-packed all weekend. But starting today, I think maybe we'll give you an example to what's happened. And please watch the rest of them. Like I mentioned, it was ever since Friday when we began with the opening program. And here today, we had two other episodes. So you'll see the first one right now. And then hopefully you can watch the other one by going to the Facebook page or going to the website, Spirit of Mandela. And let's see if we can get this started for you now. Here we are. Again, we charge genocide, the International Tribunal. All this weekend. It started October 22nd and ends 25th, which means even tomorrow there will be a live portion of this show, and they will be at the Human Rights, the United Nations. This is a very important piece to our history of who we are. So please enjoy as you hear from today's tribunal, the International Tribunal. And here we are in New York where they're having it at the Audubon, where our slain hero passed, Malcolm X, in the same building where now they have his museum. Thank you.
And I'm just so very honored that our international panelists of jurists are here to hear these days of testimony. What you have just heard was music from Brother Veronza Bowers. Veronza, who has been incarcerated for over 47 years. Veronza, who should have been released over 6 to 8 years ago. We're talking about someone who is a very gifted instrumentalist. And his feature is this very, very special flute called the Shakuhachi. I might not have it pronounced correctly, but what you were just listening to is that with overlaid ocean sounds. And it's just a remembrance to us that we have people who have been behind bars, who are extremely gifted, who are extremely talented. And what would they be doing if they were here on the outside? Such talent just going to waste. So I just wanted to make sure that we here in the room, as well as in the Zoom, had the opportunity to hear just a bit from one of our political prisoners of war. So at this time, we're about to go into count 4 of the indictment. Count one dealt with police killings and violence. Count 2 dealt with mass incarceration. Count 3 dealt with political prisoners and prisoners of war. And now count 4, we are about to start environmental racism. And we want to bring into the Zoom room live testimony on Zoom from our dear sister, Rukia Lumumba, who is the executive director of the People's Advocacy Institute of Mississippi. Rukia Lumumba, who is the sister of the current mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, Chokwe Antar Lumumba, and Rukia Lumumba, who is the daughter of my legal mentor, Brother Chokwe Lumumba, who is now in Ancestor. And her examination will be directed by Howard University Law School student Valencia R. So let's go on and begin the Zoom. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Valencia R.A., and I'm a student attorney in Howard University School of Law's Movement Lawyering Clinic. Can you state your name, where you live, and what qualifies you to testify today?
Sister Rukia, if you can hear me, I understand your audio may not be connected, but I see you now, so maybe your audio is connected. And Valencia, if you can repeat the question you just asked, but before you do, Rukia Lumumba, can you hear us?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so continue. Thank you.
Can you state your name, where you live, and what qualifies you to testify today?
Yes. So one, I just want to thank the Tribunal for providing me with the opportunity to address the Tribunal today to testify. I am Rukia Lumumba. I am the founding director of the People's Advocacy Institute. We also call it PAI. The People's Advocacy Institute is a resource and training incubator for transformative justice in the South. We, by engaging communities in electoral justice efforts, people's assemblies, alternatives to incarceration initiatives, and an intentional grassroots process for cultivating ideas and developing solutions, we build community capacity, inspire self-determination, and community-driven solutions to systemic violence, punitive legal systems, and social injustice facing far too many of our communities. But I'm not only testifying today on behalf of PAI, I'm also testifying as a member of the Movement for Black Lives, an ecosystem of individuals and organizations creating a shared vision and policy agenda to win rights, recognition, and resources for Black people. I'm also here on behalf of the Mississippi Rapid Response Coalition, a collective of over 40 organizations and individuals formed out of the frequent climate crisis occurring in Mississippi and impacting primarily Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities. The coalition is dedicated to building community-led rapid response infrastructure for the care, well-being, and safety of people and communities most vulnerable to climate disasters. Finally, I am here today to testify as a representative of the Southern Power Fund, a community fund of Southern movement organizations that have come together to move much-needed resources to Southern frontline communities responding and resisting during this current and critical political moment. My testimony comes not only from my years of working with communities, most impacted by willful and intentional government neglect, but also comes from my direct experience as a Black woman reared in Jackson, Mississippi, land of the Natchez and Choctaw people in the heart of the Deep South, a place where white invaders massacred an entire nation of people once known as the Natchez, a place that replaced Indigenous labor with forced African labor in the most inhumane conditions one can imagine, a place that has a staunch history of Black resistance to white violence, a place that birthed, let me say that again, birthed the voting rights movement of 1965, under the leadership of the amazing Fannie Lou Hamer, Medgar Evers, hundreds of brave Black Mississippians who literally sacrificed their bodies for the right to democracy. A place that has more Black elected officials than any other state within America. Yet and still, it is a place that is still under white supremacist state leadership, has the worst economic outcomes, severely crumbling infrastructure, and unattainable healthcare. Despite these barriers, we, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor Mississippians have consistently saved ourselves, creating some of the first community land trusts, cooperatives, and other collective leadership models that allow for our safety and well-being. Today, we continue in that tradition of our ancestors that maintain their commitment to the land, our self-determined right to govern the land collectively, and the human right of all people to live in environmentally safe conditions. So this is who I am, and this is why I am qualified to testify today. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you tell me about your experience regarding environmental injustices in Mississippi and throughout the southern region of the United States?
Yeah, so that's a big question. I think a few people will probably testify to some of the more major disasters that we have seen in terms of Hurricane Katrina back in 2005, where we saw the federal government completely neglect and willfully allow folks to die. For 3 days, left people in floodwaters with snakes and alligators and every creature you could imagine, left without food, in heat, dying heat, over 100 degrees heat. That happened not only in New Orleans, but we saw that impact in Mississippi that was also hit, as well as Alabama, which is the Gulf Coast. That was my first direct experience of seeing a climate disaster in which the government willfully neglected to take care of our people. And instead, we as community members began that process of figuring out, once again, how to save ourselves. And so we saw it in Katrina. But then we saw it again most recently in 2019, at the end of 2019, December 2019, moving all the way up to the beginning of 2020, so February of 2020, and then moving forward, where in Mississippi, people incarcerated in prisons, including the notorious Parchman Penitentiary, which is an 18,000-acre former plantation turned prison after Reconstruction, where people who were incarcerated initiated an uprising demanding humane living conditions. The uprising started because incarcerated people, men, women, youth, gender nonconforming people, were forced to live in small cages with raw sewage and human feces, no running water, and 24-hour lockdown. Men were forced to sleep, eat, and breathe in these toxic conditions. And these conditions didn't appear overnight, or a result of consistent neglect by the state to provide even the most basic environmentally safe conditions for over 19,000 people that they currently incarcerate in Mississippi prisons. And then in 2021, just this year, at the beginning of the year, we saw the state fail yet again to respond to keeping our communities safe. After 3 weeks without running water in 19 cities, including the capital city of Jackson, Mississippi, where over 50,000 residents were without water, after what we experienced, what people are calling an Arctic blast, leaving our pipes busted, over 130 pipes busted throughout the city, leaving thousands of residents without heat during the coldest time we have ever experienced in our lives. For those of you who don't know Mississippi, Mississippi is in a warmer climate. Most people in Mississippi don't even own a coat. We normally wear 2 sweaters when it gets cold, right? Because it doesn't get cold enough to even wear a coat most of the year. And so for us to have sheets of ice and snow with ice underneath, no salt, not enough salt to provide for the street clearings. People were stuck in their house. People were without water, without heat, pipes busted. And the state failed to call for a federal emergency, for a state emergency. They didn't fail 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. They literally failed. The governor failed to call for a state of emergency after 3 weeks. And instead of waiting on the state, what we did as Black and Indigenous and community members, immigrant-based community members, we got out on the streets. Those of us who had 4-wheel trucks that could actually go to homes where elders we knew were cold without heat, and get them heat by buying kerosene, driving miles and miles to get it, or having people come into the city to provide it to us. We began to develop this coalition that I talked about earlier called the Mississippi Response Coalition, Rapid Response Coalition, which hit every area in which Mississippians were without water, without heat, and without food due to that crisis. After the 3 weeks, when the governor finally brought in trucks to help bring potable water so people could just flush their toilets, water so that we could actually begin to see some change in our city. What we then saw is that it took another 2 more weeks before water was even restored to the city, capital city of Jackson. And many rural communities were still suffering as well. And so this neglect was not a neglect that came overnight. Just like in the prisons, it was a neglect that was intentional. It was a neglect that was based on the state's divestment from Black-led communities, Black-led cities, and cities that are predominantly Black, Indigenous, or poor. We know this because we have seen the trajectory and seen what happens in other cities that don't have that same demographic. We've seen infrastructure repair in other cities that have a more white population, but we see what happens when Black leadership takes over. The state withdraws. And so that is some of what we've been seeing in Jackson. I can talk more even about the most recent hurricane that we experienced that also left people without water, but I can answer any additional questions.
And so I want to talk a bit more about the water crisis in Jackson, but I also want to talk about the people that live there. Can you tell me a bit about the demographics of that area?
Yeah. So Jackson, Mississippi is the capital city, as I've stated before. It is over 88% Black. The numbers range between 85% and 88% at any given time, a Black city. It has a growing immigrant population of primarily indigenous folks from Central America. We have also known as, Hispanic or Latinx folks. It is also a place with a significant Vietnamese community, as well as Southeast Asian and small West and East African community. Jackson is by far the largest city by 3 times in the state of Mississippi. And it has been under Black leadership only for the past about 4 decades, which is about, not 4 decades, sorry, about 30 years. And it is a place that has unfortunately, a tax base that has been deprived of economic opportunity, has been deprived by the state of job resources. We have seen literally businesses moved out of Jackson purposefully and placed into the surrounding predominantly white suburbs as an attack on the city to begin to starve it of economic gain and to make our tax base poorer and poorer. We have about 24% of residents of Jackson are living below the poverty line. A livable wage in Mississippi does not exist. We still have a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Jackson is in this state and therefore is still subject to those laws and rules. Because we have responsible leadership, we have seen an increase in city employees' pay. We have seen a desire and a push by our city leaders, especially our mayor, to actually push for a livable wage of $15 an hour and for resources to have that. I want to just jump back a little bit to the demographics of the water. Because Jackson is a predominantly Black city, that means our water infrastructure problems impact a predominantly Black base, right? And so I believe there is correlation there around why there has been such a significant divestment from Jackson and a failure of the state until this year, a failure of the state to actually even provide resources to Jackson to fix its infrastructure problems that have existed for literally over 100 years before it ever entered into Black leadership. Our water infrastructure problem is an over $1 billion issue. And it predated any Black leadership. And it is one that the state is absolutely responsible for. And this year was the first year that the state, because of the national attention that we received, probably from many of you all in who are listening today, what we saw was the state was forced to move money to Jackson to actually immediately repair some of the broken pipes so that folks could have running water. Without that national attention, we still wouldn't have got the little bit of money that they sent, which was around $26 million to fix an over $1 billion problem. Not only is the state responsible for that, but the state, and especially the governor and the lieutenant governor, has repeatedly made attacks against Jackson, saying that its water infrastructure problem is a result of poor leadership. Our water infrastructure problem is not a result of poor leadership. It is a result of intentional and willful neglect and intentional divestment from our city and from our repairs of what needs to happen in our piping and sewage lines. And that is, to me, one of the most egregious ways that we see anti-Black racism rearing its head. And so I'll stop there.
So in a predominantly Black city such as Jackson, with a water crisis making water safe to drink and hard to come by, what impact would you say that that has on Black people, especially those that live near or below the poverty line?
You know, it has the same effect that you would think it would have on anybody, right? You know, we need water to survive. We need drinkable water. As a person who was there for the 5 weeks and 2 didn't have water, right? You don't realize how much you need water until you don't have it. You don't realize what a privilege it is to be able to flush your toilet, to be able to take a shower, to be able to drink, just literally drink a glass or take a sip of water and not have to ration it throughout the day because you don't know when you're going to get your next sip. You know, we would enter homes because we were delivering water consistently to folks. When we were finally able to get the roads cleared and trucks were able to get in to provide us with bottled water and boxed water, we began to distribute them to homes, to house, deliver them straight to house to house to house. And we would go into some elder's home and you would see the several pots lined up where they had been boiling the water once the electricity came back on so that they could actually have boiling the bottled water just so that they could take showers and do things like that. When some residents' water began to trickle in, they began to use that to boil as well in order to take showers and at least brush your teeth and do very minimal things. I mean, for weeks, businesses were shut down. It's a Black city and a lot of Black business. Businesses were shut down for weeks. The economic cost of those businesses were great. The economic hardship that it caused the city was beyond what anyone would imagine until you've experienced it. Schools were shut down, so children were forced to stay home. Parents were forced not to go to work. You know, you had situations where people who need water in order for their medical needs to be met, people on dialysis, people who were taking insulin and all of the various different medical things that you wouldn't even connect water to, but is necessary to actually perform the medical need. So many people just in bad situations, it's extremely bad, dire situations. So it caused us great hardship. Definitely impacted our well-being. And that impacts your mental health as well. Physical well-being, but also our mental.
Earlier you mentioned that you were helping to volunteer and pass out water to people in need. How do you feel people would be affected if people like you weren't out volunteering, especially with the state's response?
I can tell you right now that a lot of people would have died. It's not a question. A number of people would have died.
Can they hear me?
And our coalition had over 40 organizations that participated, where we provided them resources to get food, water, heat to people. Because remember, the water was a part of it, but in the beginning, people didn't have heat either, right? And so you have that combined, and you have Jackson is also a place with a growing. It's an aging community, meaning that we have a significant number of elders that live in this city. And these folks, and we have folks that are in desperate need of just medical care and treatment and ongoing support in that way. So without water and for small periods of time without heat, you know, and not small periods, because when you're without heat for 2 weeks, that's not a small period of time, right?
Let me interrupt for just one moment, Rukia. I'm sorry. We have a question from the Chief Judge, and one of the jurors as well. And the question is going to be via phone because she's not live here in the room. Do you want to?
Okay, go ahead now.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody for being present. I think this is a huge commitment from everybody's side of participation, the witnesses and everybody else present. My question that I want to put to Rukia Lumumba is around the issue of the 3 decades of leadership. You know, I'm from South Africa, and we are almost into 3 decades of democracy. And we find the same conditions in respect of environmental racism to a degree and racism in general. But my real question is, what are the conditions of the remaining 12% of the population of Jackson, Mississippi? Are they white, and what is their economic and environmental situation? Thank you very much, Chief Advisor. Thank you to everybody else present.
Thank you so much. That is a great question. And oftentimes when I talk about Jackson, I do compare it to conditions of our comrades in South Africa. We share a lot of similarities. And I had time to, in the late 90s, to study over at the University of Fort Hare, and those stark parallels were just, you know, I felt like I was at home literally until people started talking, right? And, you know, we had different accents. So, you know, when we talk about the 12%, I want to make it clear that Mississippi leadership, state leadership all over, is willfully neglectful around environmental justice, period, right? They care about profit over people. So in terms of whether the state has been responsible anywhere for the actual improvement of conditions of a city, we have yet to see. Normally, where there is predominantly a white population, they have the economic resources to fix the problem themselves. The state still isn't coming in to do exactly what is needed. However, the state will support them by putting businesses, by supporting and providing them tax relief, by doing other things that allow them to continue to build the wealth that they're experiencing in their communities, while depriving that from Black communities. And so what we see in Jackson is that majority of the people, one, that are in Jackson, white people that are in Jackson, have chosen to stay in Jackson primarily either as a political stance or have stayed in Jackson because you know, they got property they don't want to let go, and they don't want to be out in the rural community having to drive everywhere and not be able to be closer to resources. And so in predominantly white communities, which there are not that many, it's mainly wealthy communities. It's mainly wealthy white communities that have existed for many years, and they are closer to what we consider the water infrastructure base. So our water comes from what is called a reservoir. And that reservoir, years ago when the city was developed, you know, years and years, decades ago when the city was developed, the communities that were the water-based communities that were closer to the water base weren't developed yet. And so when that water base was developed, communities began to pop up closer to that water base because they had easier access to that water. And those have historically primarily been white, wealthier communities, white, wealthier people who have the access to purchase that land. And so as you move further and further away from the water base, you see the access to water dwindle. So for example, in South Jackson, which is historically a Black or poor white community, they have some of the worst water issues because they are furthest away from the water base and have historically been that. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and we have one more question from another jurist, and then I'll let you proceed with the testimony.
But the bottom line is, I wanted to say, the bottom line is that the state must give money to fix the infrastructure problem, period, in general.
Thank you so much for your testimony, Ms. Rukia Lumumba. This is my fellow jurist and I had a question regarding the striking information you shared about the length of time that there were broken pipes when you spoke about that climate disaster and just benign neglect. You also alluded to some patterns from other urban centers, which are also the population is Black, brown, and perhaps indigenous people. So we're wondering if there are any lead or other contamination impacts that may have resulted from this as well. Thank you.
Well, one of the good things about having responsible Black leadership that actually is rooted in community, which we haven't already always had, but we have it now, is that they take they recognize the importance of water standards. And so what we don't have a huge lead problem because we're always under boil water notice. So we do have a problem. Let me restate that. We have a problem with possible lead contamination. We have a problem with contamination of our water from other substances, elements, every time there is a climate disaster because our pipes are so bad, right? And so things can get into the water supply easily. They burst or things like that. So every time we have a major crisis, a water contamination, what we see or pipes bursting is that we'll go immediately under a boil water alert. So that one, it's time to test the water, see what's going on, or we'll be told not to drink the water at all, right? So most households in Jackson we don't drink tap water. We haven't drank tap water. I can't tell you a time when I drank tap water in Jackson without a filter. Since I grew up in Jackson, and I can't tell you a time that I drank tap water, even as a child. So most residents are relying on either a filter or bottled water because of the possibility of lead contamination and contamination based on other elements due to piping, due to poor sewage, things like that. But what I can say is that we do have our city government, our local city government is very responsible in terms of constantly working with the EPA to check the water to make sure that it is healthy at the source. The problem is, how do we get that source water to the people without it being contaminated? And that's where our $1 billion infrastructure problem comes in.
I want to switch gears just a bit and talk for a minute about climate change. So what impact would you say that climate change has on Black communities, especially those with a lot of lower income residents?
And the need. Are you all able to still hear me? Okay. Because of climate change and the many natural disasters we've experienced, prior to even last year, prior to COVID, right before COVID and right before the prison uprising, we also had another water crisis where it got cold enough that it caused a crack in our main, in the main bodies, the name of the bodies, the big water basins that hold all the water for the city. Those basins experienced a crack. And so the water was leaking out, and it had gotten so low that over 20,000, 30,000 residents were without water on New Year's Day, right? And so that required, immediate response where the city was able to get the water restored within that same day. And by the next day, most people still have their water restored. But these are just like things that are consistently happening, right? And so, and that was because we had weather that we haven't experienced before. You know, it got colder. It didn't get as cold as it did earlier this year. And so what we've seen is that climate is significantly, the extreme conditions are increasing year by year. You know, in 2019, we saw the water basins crack because of the cold weather. You know, in 2020, we saw conditions worsen. And then in 2021, we saw, this Arctic blast that wiped us out for weeks, for nearly a month. And so what it's done is it's caused our communities to actually begin to think about climate and climate change and the climate crisis. And so now when we talk about water, when we talk about rapid response, community members are now also talking about climate change and the dangers of not being prepared for the crisis of climate disaster that is always present with us now. but it also is something that people are ready to organize around. And so many of our members are part of many coalition efforts on a national basis, including work with the Movement for Black Lives, a Gulf Coast for a Green New Deal, where we're working to push policy that actually addresses some of the climate issues, including fracking. Another environmental injustice that occurred in Mississippi on the Gulf Coast was the BP oil spill. That still has impact on our communities to this day, right? And so climate change has become something that is not just, something that we talk or hear about on TV. It's something that people directly are impacted by and are ready to move and organize towards.
Thank you. Based on your experience with climate change, the water crisis, and just environmental issues in general, what factors do you think contribute the most to the impact of environmental racism, especially on Black communities?
Yeah. What impacts us the most is honestly the divestment from our communities. It is the failure of the state to, one, create policies and practices and provide resources that allow us to live our best lives. It is the state's desire for capital over people, where they allow fracking to happen, causing us to have stronger tornadoes, more frequent hurricanes that directly impact our communities. Right after the winter storm, we had a tropical storm that flooded many rural communities, Black rural communities. Right after that tropical storm, we had a tornado that hit the city of Jackson, including my neighborhood, which we are still recovering from. Right after that tornado, we then had Hurricane Ida. If you don't see the correlation between what we're doing out there on the coast in the sea by fracking, if you don't see the correlation by what we're doing by allowing all of these toxins, Mississippi has some of the most lenient policies and rules around dumping, around toxins that are allowed to be in communities. And so as we begin to see all of these things, we are definitely impacted environmentally. And so, we have to see stronger policies that actually protect the environment and therefore protect ourselves. And we have to see more resources provided to our communities, which are most vulnerable, because we do not have the economic base. We do not have the economic base to have a rapid response bag ready every time a crisis happens. We don't have the money to repurchase groceries that have gone bad because we didn't have electricity for 3 weeks, right? So many residents, that's all they said is, can you just help me get some more groceries? I had just literally, it was during a pay period that this winter storm happened. And so people had just went out and filled up their refrigerators and then came home and literally no electricity, all the food gone bad. And people had to choose between whether they were going to buy groceries or pay their rent, buy groceries or pay their utility bill, and they didn't even have electricity in the first place, or buy groceries and pay their water bill. So, I mean, these are things that we don't think about. And this climate crisis is causing us great harm in our community.
So before we close up, we have another question from one of the international jurists, okay?
Good morning. Thank you very much for your very valuable testimony. As resident of an island that was hit by 2 hurricanes, one after the other, we experienced firsthand the necessity of aid from the government institutions and usually the lack of it. I just wanted to ask you, how did the federal government respond to what you just described of the time that you spend without water because of the bursting of the water pipes, then the flooding, then the tropical storm, then the hurricane? What has been, for example, the role of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, if any at all, and what has been the role of the state government? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with the state government. The state government, thank you for that question. And I know that you know what it feels like to live in a space that is constantly in the way of climate crises. The state government has been helpful to a small part, right? And the only reason I give them that credit is because they have been forced to give something. Each year, Black leadership, not just including the current administration, but Black administrations in the past requested funding from the state to fix literally the same problems we're talking about today with our water infrastructure. And were denied. Right before this winter storm, this Arctic blast that caused the water crisis of 2021, the city administration had requested $47 million from the state to begin to fix the infrastructure problem. The governor denied it. Then this happens. Because of many people in our communities, as well as national movement, was forced the governor to actually put some funds, the governor and state legislators put some funds into Jackson. So they gave 26 million. That's how much they've given altogether to the water issue thus far. Still have not given the 47 that we've asked for. So we're still at that 26. The federal government, like I said, I think the movement of people in the streets, the work around climate, I think the work that has been happening to uplift the South and that which was often neglected in the movement. But the hard work that many of you all have done actually cast a spotlight on what was happening in Jackson. And so the federal government, for the first time in a long time, or at least from what I can remember, bypassed the state and sent 46 million to Jackson to begin immediate repairs, just so we can begin to see some improvement in our water infrastructure. So we are seeing some support from the federal government. We want to see a whole lot more. We want to see a whole lot more.
And one last part of the question. If you compare the answer of the government institutions, for example, have any of the white communities had any part in these problems? Have they been impacted in any way, the way that Jackson was impacted? And has there been a difference in the way that the governments have handled the situation in the white communities?
Yeah, so, so in Jackson, there's a very small white community. And so that community, a significant portion of that community experienced the same water crisis we experienced. Those who were closer to the water source, they didn't have, their problem wasn't as bad. But I can say across the city, we all experienced it, right? Everybody did. Everybody experienced the neglect. I think that also caused, the governor and the state legislators to finally have to do something when white folks also started to complain from Jackson, saying we still don't have water, right? The difference is that in many of those communities, they were able to leave and go to their houses in another place, in another rural community or city or out of state. They have friends in other places where they can go and be comfortable, right? Or they were able to afford hotels that had somehow figured out ways to provide water or generators for heat and electricity to their residents there. And so the rest of Jackson, who did not have those resources and were relying significantly on just the city and community-based organizations, didn't have that choice, didn't have that option, unless we were providing it to them. So But if you look outside of Jackson, and the reason I have to distinguish that is that Jackson is a predominantly Black city. When I say that the state willfully neglects to fund it, I mean the entire city. They don't care if it's white people in there or not. They're not funding it. So we all experience what we experience right in Jackson. When you go right outside of Jackson to the areas of Madison, the rural area, the suburbs, what we would consider the suburbs, Madison County, Rankin County, what you see is that, yes, the state didn't have to send them more money because the state had already been sending them money. So when this happened, they weren't in the dire situation that Jackson was in because they already had the resources, if that makes any sense.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And we're going to play a very, very short clip that was provided by Rukia Lumumba with the People's Advocacy Center, just basically putting some faces to some of the work that they are doing at this particular point. It's just a very, very short, brief clip. I'm not quite sure if it's keyed up.
And while it's keying up, I can just say that this was a video during the water crisis, the winter storm. And so this goes back to those 5 weeks where people were without water. And these are just community members that came together to provide support to each other.
Thank you very much. We really need it.
I'm blessed to get the water, and y'all doing a great job.
Thank y'all for coming out. I need water. Appreciate it.
I feel wonderful today, just helping the community and just helping my people. I feel wonderful.
We seen the need, we came through with the water trying to fill the need, you know what I'm saying?
So we don't mind still struggling, but we still help. We still help.
Thank you very much. Again, I'm Nikichi Taifa, serving as Chief People's Counsel for this International Tribunal. We're going to continue our discussion of Count 4, environmental racism, and I would like to bring to the podium Justin Hansford, who is the director of the Howard University School of Law, Thurgood Marshall Civil Rights Center, and as well as this movement lawyering conference. And he will be directing the testimony of Dr. Wendy Marshall, a professor at Temple University. Thank you very much. Professor Justin Hansford.
Thank you. May it please the court. My name is Justin Hansford, professor at Howard University, and it is my honor to be having a conversation this morning with our witness. Witness, can you please share your name and occupation with the tribunal?
My name is Wendy Marshall, and I am not a professor at Temple University. I'm an adjunct at Temple University.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. Dr. Marshall, the current unprecedented moment of climate catastrophe has deep history. What is the relationship of Black, Brown, and Indigenous bodies to the environmental crisis that we currently face?
Thank you, Justin. I want to begin with the resonant words of the brilliant Laguno Pueblo author Leslie Marmon Silko and the ancestor Aimé Césaire, the fierce poet, theorist, and founder of the Negritude movement. I do that because I want to make sure that people are clear that data and statistics are not going to get it here. So first, Silko. In So Silko wrote, "We are all part of the old stories, whether we know the stories or not. The old stories know about us. From time immemorial, the old stories encompass all events, past and future. The spirits of the ancestors cry out for justice. Their voices are louder now. The mountains shake and fall. The hurricane winds scour the earth. Fire and flood engulf the cities as the ancestor spirits announce the time will return. There will be no peace in the Americas until there is justice for the earth and her children." Second is Poetry and Knowledge from Aimé Césaire, who argued that while science produced a certain impression of the world, it was summary and superficial. He wrote, "Physics classifies and explains, but the essence of things eludes it. As for mathematics, what eludes its abstract and logical activity is reality itself. In short, scientific knowledge enumerates, measures, classifies, and kills. But it is not sufficient to state that scientific knowledge is summary. It is necessary to add that it is poor and half-starved. To acquire it, mankind has sacrificed everything: desires, fears, feelings, and impoverished knowledge, I submit. For at its inception, whatever other wealth that it may have, there stands an impoverished humanity." So Césaire's work in Poetry and Knowledge warns us that statistical portraits, counting, and classification are limited means of understanding humanity. Understanding humanity requires us to look around and see and feel the vast web of environmental, political, economic, spiritual destruction in which we are embedded, and the disproportionate and deadly, often state and corporate sponsored harm that befalls Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. 500 years into this Western experience with racialized capitalism, Black labor is still exploited, our cultures and knowledges still demoted and repressed. We die prematurely, we struggle to live, we are unable to breathe. The rising floods and raging fires, hurricanes and tornadoes presage a planet inhospitable to humanity. We are in the struggle of and for our lives. The crises we face are multidimensional: political, epidemiological, environmental. White supremacy and capitalism joined from the beginning to produce processes of destruction which now reach crescendo. Euro-American wealth began at the nexus of the privatization of the means of sustenance, the enclosure of the land, and the enforced proletarianization of the masses in Europe. The conquest of the African continent, the forced transportation of 12 million Black bodies, and the genocidal theft of these indigenous lands. The blood and sweat of Africans transported to this hemisphere and the vast stolen lands of our indigenous siblings were the basis of the concentrated financial and political power of an exceedingly small white owning class. The earth and the people are raped, pillaged, and exploited. Fueled by white greed and the drive for profit, our lives have never mattered much, except as essential exploited labor. Perceived as an inanimate resource, the earth, our mother, has never mattered much, except as a means of accruing wealth. Marx's concept of the metabolic rift captured the material estrangement of human beings in capitalist society from the natural conditions of their existence. The theory of the rift was based upon the notions of reciprocity and mutuality between nature and humans who are understood as part of nature. This is a crucial part of understanding racialized capitalism and settler colonialism, because the imperative of profit creates successive waves of destruction. There is a correlation between air toxicity, race, class, cancer, and COVID, evident in the destroyed lives of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. The relationship between water contamination and disease, especially for rural people, farm workers, and Indigenous people, is clear. Water flowing through poisoned pipes in Newark, Chicago, Flint, and elsewhere is connected to neurodevelopmental damage and to the mass criminalization of our children. A warming world creates more powerful storms, and it is Indigenous people in Louisiana, immigrants in New York City, and other communities of color who are dispossessed and who die when the waters rise. The year 2020 was the hottest year for the Earth's surface. Driven in large part by industrial agriculture and fossil fuel extraction, greenhouse gas concentrations reached a record high. In the summer of 2020, Arctic ice mass was at the lowest level since record keeping began in the 1970s. Rapid loss of the Earth's ice mitigates the role that ice plays in lowering Earth's temperature by reflecting heat back into space. It raises sea levels and warms the oceans, processes which intensify climate catastrophe and further cycles of dispossession. Driven by capitalism's profit imperative, the myth of endless growth on a finite planet, and a hegemonic ethos that justifies the exploitation and murder of natural and human life, the world is experiencing the sixth mass extinction. In half of known vertebrate species, nearly 1/3 have been obliterated. 177 mammal species have lost 30% of their geographic ranges, and more than 40% of such mammals have experienced severe population decline. This data on biological annihilation indicates that beyond global species extinctions, Earth is experiencing a huge episode of population declines and extirpations, which will have negative cascading consequences on ecosystem functioning and services vital to sustaining civilization. Described by researchers as possibly the most serious threat to the persistence of civilization, the sixth mass extinction is irreversible. The loss of natural life is permanent. The increasing emergence of novel pathogens, along with the destruction of soil and water, deforestation, the torture of animals in industrial agriculture, declining nutrition, land dispossession, and farmer suicide stem from capital's rigorous exigency for profit. Across the globe, capital is encroaching on the last of primary forests and of peasant-held farmlands. Deforestation and development catalyze the emergence of diseases into human populations that were once contained by the border between developed lands and the primary forests. The diversity and complexity of primary forest ecosystems, including wildlife and pathogens, are let loose by capitalism's drive for profit, causing spillover into life and humans. At the center of this 500-year-old conflagration, this epic of death and destruction, is a profound contempt for the sanctity of Earth and her people. Having the data to support claims of human rights abuses and genocide is important, but equally important is hearing the voices of the ancestors and of the rivers and the sea, of the mountains and the sky. The ancestor and revolutionary Berta Cáceres reminds us of this. "Let us wake up," she said. "Let us wake up, humankind. We are out of time. We must shake our conscience free of the rapacious capitalism, racism, and patriarchy that will only assure our own self-destruction." Thank you.
Thank you so much for that statement. I want to also bring in the United Nations standards, specifically the Human Rights Council's statement that human beings have the right to clean air, health, and a safe climate. Rights that are not contingent upon one's race, ethnicity, nationality, or religious background. In light of the profound statements you just shared with us, do you believe that?
So we are happy to have at least today's first part of the International Tribunal. We are hoping that for the rest of the week, you try to listen to the recordings of the tribunal. You can find them not only at the Spirit of Mandela on their Facebook, but also at their website, and that is Spirit of Mandela, https://spiritofmandela.org, or contact them at spiritofmandela1@gmail.com. Their Instagram is Spirit of Mandela, and their Twitter is In the Spirit, TT, at the end. So if you can connect in right on their Facebook page. There are all the sessions from Friday, where it started October 24th, 10 to 5 p.m. There was today, the charges relating to environmental justice, which you heard today, featuring the expert witnesses of Rukia Lumumba, Wendy Marshall, and then the Imam Jacqueline Brown will be doing that. Also on this tape for today is the charges relating to health inequities. Expert witnesses such as Dr. Mary Louise Patterson, Olga Sanabera, and Chase Iron Eyes, and others. So for tomorrow, what will be happening? Everything has been live streamed since Friday. Tomorrow, they will be going to the United Nations. They will be having all of this information live stream, so you'll be able to really be a part of that movement, to be there at the in the spirit of 3 days in the tribunal. But please listen and watch the rest of the tapes. And, you know, like we always say, this is something we are very happy to bring to political education for the masses of African American families and people and children. And unfortunately, we're not able to do this 24/7, 365 days of the year. We wish we could have it 24/7. And that way we would be able to center in things that haven't been taught to us when it comes to the Black radical tradition. But we are grateful that we do have this. It is our duty once a week on Sundays from 6 to 7 Pacific time. So we are grateful for your attention. We're grateful for you to coming through and joining us on this another episode. And we will be able to connect in with you again next week. Thank you and have a good evening.